It was a calm evening in a quiet American town where people usually went about their business without much trouble. The streets were peaceful, the traffic was light, and most people were either heading home or stopping by a local diner for coffee. On that same evening, a police officer sat in his patrol car parked near a gas station, watching cars go by. He had worked in this town for years and thought he knew everyone who passed through. He took pride in his job and liked to believe he had control over every situation he faced. But sometimes his pride got in the way of his judgment. As he leaned back in his seat, a silver car caught his attention. It wasn't speeding or breaking any rule, but something about it made him curious. The driver looked calm, too calm for his liking. The officer decided to follow the car for a bit, convincing himself it was part of his duty. When the car turned into a quiet road, the officer turned on his lights and pulled it over. The flashing red and blue reflected off the car's windows, painting the dark road in colors that warned something was about to happen. Inside the silver car, the driver sighed softly. He didn't argue or panic. He simply rolled down his window and waited. He looked like someone who worked long hours, neatly dressed but tired. He didn't seem dangerous, but the officer had already made up his mind that something about this man needed questioning. As he approached, the officer placed his hand near his holster, not because he felt threatened, but because it made him feel more in control. "License and registration," the officer said firmly. His tone wasn't rude, but it carried an authority that left little room for comfort. The man quietly handed over his documents. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked in a polite, calm tone. "We'll see about that," the officer replied, glancing over the ID. The address mentioned a facility near the outskirts of town, a place most locals didn't know much about. It had high fences, armed security, and a reputation for being a government site of some sort. The officer frowned. "What do you do at this place?" he asked sharply. "I'm a consultant," the man replied. "I work with a defense project." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Defense project, huh? You expect me to believe that?" He chuckled under his breath. "People around here don't work for defense projects. They work at stores, farms, and offices. You got any proof of that?" The man looked at him quietly for a moment. "My ID is real," he said simply. "You can verify it if you like." The next morning began like any other in the small police department. Officers walked in with cups of coffee, exchanging jokes and greetings. The air smelled of fresh paper and brewed coffee, and no one had any idea that something serious was coming their way. The officer from the previous night arrived for his shift, still unaware of how quickly things had escalated. He greeted a few colleagues, straightened his badge, and prepared for another regular day on patrol. Meanwhile, the police chief sat in his office staring at his phone. He had already received 2 calls since sunrise, one from the state headquarters and another from a federal contact. The tone on the other end had been calm but direct. They were asking for details about a traffic stop involving one of his officers and a man connected to the Pentagon. The chief had felt a wave of disbelief, thinking at first it might be a mistake. But when the official read out the driver's name, his heart sank. It was the same man his officer had pulled over the night before. The chief knew this wasn't something that could be brushed off. He had been in law enforcement for over 20 years, and he could tell when a situation had gone beyond local control. He called in his deputy and quietly said, "Get the officer in here now." When the officer arrived, the chief looked up from his desk, his expression heavy. "Close the door," he said. The sound of the latch clicking shut seemed louder than usual. "Sir, what's this about?" the officer asked, trying to sound casual. The chief took a deep breath and leaned forward. "I got a call this morning from Washington. The man you stopped last night isn't just anyone. He works on classified defense projects under Pentagon supervision. He has security clearance higher than both of us combined." The officer blinked, not sure what to say. He had assumed the man's story was exaggerated. "He said something like that, but I thought he was bluffing." "I was just doing my job, sir." The chief's voice grew firm. "Doing your job doesn't mean questioning someone's identity without cause, or talking down to them like they're lying." The man didn't complain emotionally, he just reported facts. And those facts are already sitting on a federal desk. The officer opened his mouth to respond, but couldn't find words. The room suddenly felt small and the air felt heavy. The chief continued, "They want a full report, body cam footage, and your written statement before noon. And until this is reviewed, you're off patrol." Those words hit hard. The officer stood frozen for a moment before slowly nodding. He walked out of the office, feeling every pair of eyes turned toward him. His colleagues, sensing something serious, avoided asking questions. No one wanted to be part of whatever this was. In another part of the country, inside a sleek government building, a quiet conversation was taking place. The man who had been stopped sat across from days turned into weeks, and the town slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. The sound of police sirens, once a symbol of authority, now carried a different meaning for the officer who had been suspended. He often watched patrol cars drive by his house from his porch, wondering how something so ordinary had changed his life completely. He missed being in uniform, not because of the power it gave him, but because it had been part of his identity for so long. Now, stripped of that routine, he was left with his thoughts and silence. The department, too, had changed. The incident had become a quiet lesson for everyone. Officers spoke more softly, paid more attention to their tone, and avoided unnecessary confrontations. The chief made sure that every new recruit went through an extra round of training, focused on empathy and respect. He didn't mention the incident openly, but everyone knew what had inspired the change. Meanwhile, the officer spent his days attending mandatory retraining sessions. The classes were held in a nearby city and covered everything from communication to emotional awareness. The first few days were difficult for him. Sitting in a classroom with people half his age made him feel small. He had been the one giving orders for years, not taking lessons. But as time went on, he began to see things differently. One of the instructors, an older man with decades of experience, told a story that struck him deeply. It was about a young officer who once pulled over a nervous driver and handled it badly, simply because he mistook fear for guilt. That small mistake had led to consequences that haunted the young officer for years. Sometimes, the instructor said, the most dangerous thing we carry on duty isn't a weapon, it's our ego. Those words stayed with him. He began to realize how much of his own behavior had been shaped by pride. He had thought that showing authority meant being firm, loud, and commanding. But real authority, he now understood, came from self-control and fairness. After each session, he would drive home quietly, his mind replaying old memories of the job, some good, some painful. He remembered helping accident victims, guiding lost children, and calming down people during fights. But mixed in with those memories were moments he wasn't proud of, times he had spoken harshly, acted impatiently, or assumed the worst about people. Those moments had once seemed small, but now they stood out sharply. One evening, he received a message from the chief asking to meet at the station. It was the first time he had been called back since the suspension. His hands trembled slightly as he drove there. When he walked into the chief's office, he found him sitting with a serious but calm expression. "Sit down," the chief said. He waited for a moment before continuing. "The review is almost over. The federal office is satisfied with the steps we've taken. You'll be reinstated soon, but under certain conditions. You'll be monitored for a while, and I want you to take on community assignments first, not patrol." The officer nodded. He expected strict conditions, and he was ready to accept them. The chief looked at him for a long moment before adding, "You know, I've been thinking about what that man said, about power being dangerous when it's misjudged. He wasn't wrong, and I think you understand that better now." "I do," the officer said quietly. "I wish I had understood it earlier." "Understanding it now is what matters," the chief replied. "We all make mistakes. What defines us is what we do after them." When the officer left the office that evening, he felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. He wasn't proud, but he was determined to make things right. A few days later, the morning air carried a heavy silence across the small town as the suspended officer sat by his window, watching people move on with their lives. The world outside seemed normal, but for him everything had changed. He had once walked these streets with pride, feeling respected in his uniform. Now every familiar face seemed to carry a hint of judgment. The department had opened a full inquiry against him, and he knew that his actions, though small in his eyes at the time, had caused ripples that reached far beyond what he could ever imagine. He spent hours thinking about that day, the stop, the man's calm voice, and the way he had brushed off the man's explanati. It haunted him. It wasn't just about losing his badge or facing punishment. It was about realizing how carelessly he had treated another human being. Power had made him forget the very duty he had sworn to uphold, To serve, not to intimidate. Each thought cut deeper than any punishment could. When the internal review began, he was called to the department's main office. The waiting room was cold and quiet. He could hear muffled voices through the glass door. When he was finally called in, the investigators didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. They simply played the body cam footage in front of him. Every second felt heavier than the last. His own voice, sharp, impatient, dismissive, echoed through the small room. The man's calm and respectful tone in contrast made him feel even smaller. The officer didn't try to defend himself. There was no excuse he could. The sun was just beginning to rise over the town when the officer parked his car by the station. It had been months since he had been fully reinstated, and life had settled into a steady rhythm again. But something about this morning felt different. Maybe it was the way the air felt lighter, or the way the early light reflected on the wet streets. It reminded him of how far he had come since the day everything had fallen apart. The past year had been a journey through doubt, humility, and rediscovery. And though the road had been hard, it had changed him in ways he never thought possible. When he walked into the station, he was greeted with polite nods and quiet smiles. There was still a sense of distance from some officers, but it no longer bothered him. He didn't need everyone's approval anymore. What mattered to him now was doing his job with respect and fairness. He had learned that the smallest acts of kindness could carry more power than authority ever could. That morning, the chief called him into the office. "I need you to handle something today," the chief said. "It's a community meeting downtown. People want to discuss safety concerns and police behavior. I think you're the right person to represent us." The officer was surprised. A year ago, no one would have trusted him with such a responsibility. Now the chief's tone carried confidence. He nodded and said he would be there. Later that afternoon, he arrived at the community hall. The place was filled with residents, shop owners, parents, students, and even some of the department's critics. The officer sat quietly as people shared their thoughts. Some spoke about how they still feared being mistreated. Others said they wanted to believe things could change. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up slowly and took a deep breath. He didn't use formal words or polished statements. He spoke from the heart. "I made mistakes," he began. "I once thought wearing a badge meant people had to respect me. But I learned the hard way that real respect is earned through how we treat others. I can't change the past, but I can promise that every day I wear this uniform now, I'll do better." His honesty caught the room off guard. There was silence at first, then a few nods, then soft applause. For the first time, he felt like people truly saw him. Not as a cop trying to defend himself, but as a man who had learned what respect really meant. After the meeting, several people approached him to shake his hand. One woman told him she had avoided calling the police for years because of fear, but after hearing him speak, she felt she could trust again. That meant more to him than any award or recognition ever could. As he drove home later, he realized that healing was not just about fixing his own mistakes. It was about rebuilding the trust others had lost because of them. Weeks passed, and he continued to work quietly. He became known for his patience and fairness. When young officers joined the force, the chief often paired them with him for training. He taught them the same lessons he had learned through pain and reflection. "Listen first," he would tell them. "People want to be heard before they're judged. If you can do that, half your job is already done." The rookies respected him because he didn't preach, he led by example. One day, while handling a routine patrol, he received a call about a car stopped on the side of the highway. He drove there and found a man standing beside a vehicle with a flat tire. The man was calm, checking his phone. When the officer walked up, the man turned around, and for a second, the officer froze. The face was familiar. It was him, the same man from that day, the one whose quiet strength had changed his life. For a moment, both men stood silently, recognizing each other. The air between them was calm, not tense. The officer spoke first. "It's been a long time," he said softly. The man nodded. "Yes, it has." There was no anger in his voice, only quiet understanding. The officer offered to help with the tire. Together they worked in silence, both aware of how different this meeting was from the first. When they finished, the man thanked him sincerely. "I see you're still serving," he said. The officer nodded. "Yes," he replied, "but I serve differently now." The man smiled. "That's good to hear. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones that make us better. The words carried warmth, not judgment. The officer felt a lump in his throat but managed a quiet, "Thank you for everything." They parted with a handshake, but it was more than that. It was forgiveness. It was closure. As the officer watched the man drive away, he felt something inside him settle. The past no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a lesson completed. Later that evening, as the officer sat on his porch, he thought about how strange life could be. The same event that once brought him shame had become the reason he understood what true service meant. He realized that redemption wasn't about erasing mistakes, it was about living differently afterward. It was about consistency, patience, and honesty. In the months that followed, the officer continued to dedicate himself to his work. He organized small workshops for young recruits and even for local teenagers, teaching them about respect, empathy, and responsibility. He didn't talk about his past directly, but everyone knew there was a story behind his calm tone and careful words. People respected him not for being perfect, but for being real. He also started writing down his thoughts in a notebook, small reflections from his daily experiences. Some were about the people he met, others about his own emotions. One page read, "Power is not in control. Power is in compassion." Another said, "Every person you meet has a story. Treat them like it matters." Writing became his quiet therapy. One day the chief called him in again. "You've come a long way," the chief said. "The department wants to promote you. You've earned it." The officer was humbled. He accepted not as a reward, but as a chance to guide others. His leadership style was different from what people were used to. He never shouted, never demanded. He asked questions, listened carefully, and always reminded his team that the badge was a promise, not a privilege. Under his guidance, the department began to change. Complaints dropped, community trust grew, and people began to see the police not as enforcers, but as partners. It wasn't a perfect system. There were still challenges, mistakes, and misunderstandings, but there was also progress. And every bit of that progress reminded him why he had chosen to change. One evening, while he was closing his office, a young officer stopped by. "Sir," the young man said, "I heard about what happened years ago. Some of the older guys talk about it. Is it true?" The officer smiled faintly. "Yes, it's true," he said. The young officer hesitated. "How did you get through it?" The older man looked at him and replied, "By facing it. By not pretending it didn't happen. Mistakes don't define you. How you learn from them does." The young man nodded, clearly moved. Before leaving, he said, "I hope I can be like you someday." That moment made everything worth it. Years later, when the officer finally retired, the town held a small gathering in his honor. There were no big speeches, no fancy awards, just a room full of people, some from the department, some from the community, who had come to thank him. Among the crowd, he saw familiar faces, families he had helped, colleagues he had guided, and even some who had once doubted him. They all came together to celebrate not the officer he was, but the man he had become. During his farewell, he said quietly, "I started this journey thinking power was about being obeyed. I ended knowing power is about understanding others. If I've learned anything, it's that respect is the real strength behind the badge." The room fell silent for a moment, then erupted in applause. The sound filled the hall, echoing the truth of his words. That night, as he walked home, the town lights glowed softly, and the air carried a quiet peace. He passed the same street where everything had once gone wrong. He stopped for a moment looking at it. The memories didn't hurt anymore, they felt distant, like pages from a book he had already finished. He whispered a small thank you to the man who had unknowingly changed his path, then turned toward home. In the years that followed, his story continued to inspire others. New recruits heard about him not as a cautionary tale, but as an example of change. His journey became proof that even those who fall can rise stronger if they choose humility over pride. The officer lived the rest of his days quietly, surrounded by family, friends, and a town that respected him. Sometimes he would sit on his porch at sunset, thinking about the strange twist of fate that had turned his mistake into his greatest lesson. He had once believed that power meant never being questioned, but now he understood that true power came from being accountable. And in that understanding, he found peace. The story that began with pride and punishment ended with forgiveness and wisdom. It became a reminder for everyone who heard it that no matter how far a person falls, redemption is always within reach if they are willing to change. It wasn't just the end of his journey. It was the beginning of a legacy built not on authority but on humanity. Give. The footage spoke louder than words. After the meeting, he was told that the Pentagon had been notified and that the department had to cooperate fully with federal oversight. The officer couldn't believe how far this had gone. He sat quietly listening as his chief spoke with disappointment. "You didn't just stop a man," the chief said quietly. "You stopped someone working on something important. Someone trusted with national matters. Do you realize what that means?" The officer nodded, unable to look up. Days turned into weeks. He spent his suspension reflecting on everything. His badge lay inside a drawer, a reminder of what he had lost. Friends from the force stopped calling. The silence in his life became his teacher. He began volunteering at a local shelter, not for redemption, but because he needed to feel useful again. There he met people who had been mistreated in different ways, by systems, by authority, by those meant to protect them. Listening to their stories humbled him. He saw how easy it was for someone in power to forget compassion. Meanwhile, news of the incident spread slowly. It wasn't front-page material, but within law enforcement circles it became a whispered example of what could happen when pride replaced respect. Officers in other departments discussed the story as a warning. Some defended him, saying anyone could make a mistake under pressure. Others said he had let the badge get to his head. But no matter what people said, the truth was clear. One small act of arrogance had changed everything. The man he had stopped remained silent through it all. No public statements, no media appearances. He had simply filed the report and moved on. Yet that quietness spoke volumes. It showed dignity, patience, and restraint, the very qualities the officer had lacked that day. That realization stayed with him more than any disciplinary action ever could. One evening, as he sat by the shelter's entrance, an older man approached him. They started talking casually about life, choices, and regrets. The officer didn't mention his job, but the old man somehow sensed it. "You carry the weight of something," he said gently. "Sometimes we forget that respect is not given because of position. It's earned by how we treat others." Those words hit him harder than any lecture. He realized that he had spent years demanding respect instead of earning it. Eventually, a notice arrived from the department. He was to attend a review meeting to determine whether he could return to duty. The night before the meeting, he couldn't sleep. He went for a long walk, passing by the very road where it all began. The streetlights glowed faintly, and the memory of that day played vividly in his mind. He remembered the man's calm face, the tension in his own voice, and how he had dismissed the man's ID. He whispered to himself, "You were wrong." Saying those words out loud lifted a small weight off his chest. At the review board, he was asked what he had learned. He didn't give a rehearsed speech. He simply said, "I learned that authority is not about control. It's about responsibility. I forgot that and I paid for it." His words were simple, but they carried sincerity. The board listened. Some nodded, others remained neutral. The final decision would take time, but he knew that whatever the outcome, he had changed. After the meeting, he met the chief privately. The man's expression was softer this time. "You made a big mistake," the chief said, "but you also faced it. That's more than most would do." The officer thanked him and left quietly. Walking out of the building, he felt the air differently, lighter somehow. The shame hadn't vanished, but it had turned into something useful. Awareness. In the following weeks, he continued volunteering, even though his suspension was nearly over. The people at the shelter had started trusting him. They talked to him, laughed with him, and listened when he shared small pieces of advice about patience and empathy. For the first time in years, he felt like he was making a difference, not because of his badge, but because of his heart. The department eventually reinstated him, but under a strict condition. He was to undergo retraining focused on communication, community engagement, and emotional discipline. He didn't protest. He welcomed it. During those sessions, he met other officers who had gone through similar mistakes. Listening to their stories reminded him that everyone, no matter how experienced, could lose sight of their purpose if they let ego take over. Months later, when he finally put his uniform back on, it felt different. It wasn't a symbol of power anymore, it was a reminder of humility. He approached his duties with a quieter strength. When he stopped drivers now, he made sure to listen. He looked people in the eyes, spoke politely, and explained his reasons calmly. The community began to notice the change. Some people who had once avoided him now greeted him with respect. Slowly, trust returned. But he never forgot the man who changed everything. Sometimes he wondered if fate would ever cross their paths again. Deep down, he hoped it would, not to apologize for the sake of clearing his conscience, but to thank him for the lesson. The incident that once brought him shame had turned into the turning point of his life. One afternoon, while sitting at a roadside cafe during his patrol break, he overheard two young officers talking about how they handled people during stops. One of them said, "It's important to stay in control. They need to know who's in charge." The other nodded. The older officer smiled softly and said, "Control doesn't mean disrespect. Remember, sometimes the person you stop might be the one teaching you something important." They looked surprised but listened carefully. His words carried weight, not because of rank but because of the experience behind them. Over time, the story of the incident became a quiet legend within the department. New recruits were told about it during training sessions. It was never mentioned by name, but everyone knew. The lesson was clear. The badge doesn't make you better than others, it gives you the duty to treat them better. The officer still had difficult days. Some people never forgot his mistake, but he accepted that as part of his journey. Every time he felt frustrated, he reminded himself of the calm man who had taught him humility without anger. That memory became his compass. As months turned into a year, the town moved on. The noise faded, the headlines disappeared, but the impact remained. The officer became one of the most respected figures in his department, not because of power, but because of how he carried himself. He had learned to listen more, to speak less, and to see people for who they were, not what they looked like. And though he never met the man again, he often thought of him as a silent mentor, someone who had shown him, through patience and grace, what true strength looked like. The story that began with pride had ended in humility, proving that sometimes the hardest lessons come from the simplest mistakes. It wasn't just about redemption. It was about understanding that respect once lost can only be regained through honest change. And in that understanding, the officer finally found peace, began his community assignment. His new role involved working with local schools and organizing safety workshops. At first, some people avoided him. Word about the Pentagon incident had spread, even if only in whispers. Parents looked at him with hesitation, unsure if they could trust him. But he didn't complain. Instead, he focused on doing his job quietly and sincerely. One afternoon, after a session with high school students, a teacher approached him. She said, "I heard about what happened a while ago. I just wanted to say it takes courage to come back and face people. Not everyone can do that." Her words lifted something inside him. For the first time in a long while, he felt that maybe he could rebuild his reputation not through authority, but through humility. Meanwhile, in the federal building miles away, the man who had been stopped had almost forgotten the incident. His life had gone back to normal, meetings, reports, and long hours of research. But one afternoon, he received a brief update from his department. It mentioned that the officer involved had completed retraining and had been reinstated. The message ended with a note: "Corrective action successfully implemented." He read the line twice, then leaned back in his chair. He didn't feel anger or satisfaction, just a quiet sense of closure. He believed that people could change, and maybe this was proof of it. Back in the small town, the officer continued his new role with genuine effort. He started volunteering on weekends, helping with traffic awareness programs and senior citizen safety drives. Slowly, people began to see him differently. They noticed the change in his tone, his patience, and his willingness to listen. One day, while directing traffic during a community parade, an elderly man walked up to him and said, "You seem different lately, calmer." The officer smiled and replied, "Maybe I finally learned what this badge really means." The man nodded approvingly and walked away. That small exchange meant more to him than any medal he had ever received. But even as he tried to move forward, the past lingered. There were still moments when he replayed that night in his mind. The flashing lights, the calm voice of the man, and the heavy silence that followed. Sometimes he wished he could apologize direct. But he knew that wasn't necessary. The best apology, he told himself, was to never repeat the mistake. Months passed, and the officer's efforts began to show results. His workshops gained popularity, and people started inviting him to community discussions. Local newspapers even mentioned his name once, describing how he was helping bridge the gap between police and civilians. It wasn't fame he wanted, it was redemption. Then one morning, he received a letter from the police chief. Inside was a copy of a formal appreciation note sent from the federal department. It didn't mention names, but it acknowledged the improvement in conduct and the successful completion of corrective measures. At the end of the note, there was a small handwritten line. Respect is earned twice, once by power, once by humility. The second lasts longer. He knew who had written that line. It was from the man he had stopped months ago. He stared at the words for a long time, feeling a strange mixture of relief and gratitude. He realized that sometimes the people we wrong are the very ones who end up teaching us the biggest lessons. That evening, he went for a drive through the same road where it had all begun. The town looked the same gas station, the same quiet streets, the same distant glow of streetlights. But for him, everything felt different. The air was lighter, the silence softer. He parked by the side of the road and turned off the engine. Sitting there, he thought about how one small decision had changed the course of his life. What started as an act of pride had become a journey of self-realization. He now understood that authority didn't make him strong. Empathy did. The man he had stopped had unknowingly become his teacher, not through anger or revenge, but through calmness and dignity. He smiled to himself and whispered, "Thank you," as if the man could somehow hear him through the night air. As he drove back to town, he noticed a young officer pulling over a car. The sight made him slow down. He watched carefully, observing the tone and body language of the officer. When he saw that everything was being handled with patience and respect, he nodded quietly to himself. Maybe his story had already started making a difference. When he returned to the station, the chief greeted him with a rare smile. "You've come a long way," he said. "Still learning," the officer replied. "We all are," the chief said with a nod. "That's what keeps us human." The days that followed were peaceful. The officer no longer sought recognition or praise. His focus was simple: to serve with honesty, patience, and humility. He knew he couldn't erase the past, but he could shape the future by being the kind of officer he once thought he was. Every now and then he would catch himself smiling at the irony of it all. The incident that had nearly ended his career had turned into the very reason he became better at his job. Life, he realized, had a strange way of teaching lessons, not through rewards, but through mistakes. The story of that traffic stop faded over time, becoming something people only mentioned quietly. But for him, it would never fade. It lived in his memory as a reminder that power, when guided by ego, can destroy, but when guided by understanding, it can protect. And so he continued to serve, not as the officer who once misjudged power, but as the man who had learned to use it wisely. The town saw him differently now. Children waved at him, adults greeted him warmly, and even those who once doubted him now respected him. It wasn't fear that earned him that respect anymore, it was trust. He had finally understood what true authority meant, not the right to command, but the strength to listen. And in that understanding, he found peace, his superior, explaining what had happened in his usual calm way. He didn't dramatize it, but his words carried weight. "It wasn't about me, sir. It was about how easily power can be misused," he said. His superior nodded, taking notes. "We don't like when things like this happen," the superior said. "Not because of rank, but because it reflects how some people handle authority." He paused, then added, "Don't worry, we'll take care of it properly." By the afternoon, an official email reached the local police chief. The message requested access to the patrol footage and a summary of the department's internal training on conduct during traffic stops. It was worded politely, but the tone left no room for delay. The chief knew what it meant. They were under review. The news spread quietly within the department. Everyone spoke in low tones, avoiding the officer's gaze. Some sympathized with him, saying it was just a misunderstanding. Others whispered that he had finally crossed the line. He had always been confident, too confident, some said, and often treated minor cases as if they were high-stakes investigations. He liked to feel in charge, and that confidence had been mistaken for arrogance more than once. That evening, as he sat in the locker room alone, he kept replaying the body cam footage in his mind. His voice, the tone he used, the way the man stood quietly without arguing. The officer realized how it might look to someone watching. A calm, respectful man being questioned without cause, and a cop sounding impatient and dismissive. It wasn't illegal, but it looked wrong. It looked like pride instead of professionalism. He rubbed his temples, feeling a headache forming. It wasn't just fear of losing his job. It was the sinking feeling that he had let his own ego take control. He remembered the man's words again. Power is more dangerous when it's misjudged. At the time, he had brushed it off. Now it echoed louder in his mind. The next morning, 2 plain vehicles arrived at the department. They weren't police cars. They belonged to internal affairs investigators. They walked in calmly, showing their credentials, and requested a private room. The officer was called in for questioning. The interview lasted hours. They asked everything, from why he decided to stop the car to why he ignored the ID information. He explained that the man looked suspicious, that his instincts told him something was off. But the investigators pointed out that instincts are not proof, and that his tone had been unnecessarily forceful. "You understand this wasn't about a ticket," one of them said softly. "It's about how an officer uses his power. Authority isn't just about control, it's about responsibility." By the time they left, the officer felt drained. He went home early, unable to face his colleagues. The once proud feeling he had in his uniform had turned into something else, a reminder of how quickly respect could turn into regret. Meanwhile, the story began to make quiet rounds outside the department. It wasn't on the news yet, but people who worked in government circles had started discussing it. They didn't mention names, but the summary was enough. A local officer had mishandled a stop involving a Pentagon consultant. Some called it an overreach of authority. Others called it a lesson in humility. In the small town, no one knew the details, but rumors started spreading. People whispered that someone important had been stopped unfairly. Some said the officer might be fired. Others thought it would blow over. But deep down, everyone sensed that this wasn't an ordinary mistake. The officer's family noticed the change in him too. He became quieter, avoiding dinner conversations. His confidence, once visible in every gesture, seemed to fade. Late at night, he would sit on the porch staring at the empty street, thinking about the choices that led him here. One evening, the police chief stopped by his house. He didn't come as a superior, but as a mentor. He sat beside him and said, "You know, every officer faces a moment that defines their career. For some, it's a rescue. For others, it's a mistake. What matters is what you learn from it." The officer nodded slowly. "I didn't mean for it to go that way. I just thought I was doing what was right." "Sometimes doing what's right means understanding when to step back," the chief replied. "You had the law on your side, but not judgment. There's a difference." The conversation ended quietly, but those words stayed with him. The next few weeks were filled with reports, reviews, and official correspondence. Every move was being watched. The officer remained suspended, waiting for the outcome. On the other side, the man who had been stopped never sought revenge or media attention. He went back to his work, never mentioning the incident again. His calmness and restraint made people around him respect him even more. When asked why he didn't press harder, he simply said, "When power is misused, exposure is punishment enough." That statement eventually reached the department through quiet channels. It struck the chief deeply. He shared it with his team during a briefing. "Let this be a reminder," he said. "Authority is not a privilege, it's a duty. And when we forget that, someone always pays the price, even if it's us." As days turned into weeks, tension in the department began to ease. The case had moved up for final review. While no one knew what decision would come, the officer had already changed. He started reading about communication, emotional control, and the psychology of authority. He wanted to understand where he went wrong, not just to protect his career, but to become someone better. When the federal review finally concluded, the department received a letter. It didn't demand firing, but it strongly recommended retraining and public accountability. The officer would remain suspended for a period, but could return after completing new courses in behavioral ethics and community engagement. When the chief told him the news, the officer felt relief mixed with shame. It wasn't an escape. It was a second chance. He thanked the chief quietly and promised to change. That night, he sat again in his patrol car, parked under the same streetlight where everything began. The memory of that traffic stop still played in his mind, but now it came with understanding. He looked up at the sky and whispered to himself, "Power doesn't make you right. Doing right does." And somewhere far from that quiet town, the man who had been stopped read the report about the officer's retraining and smiled faintly. He wasn't angry anymore. Maybe in a way things had turned out the way they were supposed to. A mistake becoming a lesson, pride turning into growth, and a single moment reminding everyone that respect, when lost, can only be regained through humility. But the officer didn't want to verify anything. He wanted to feel that he was in control. The man's calmness irritated him. It made him feel like he wasn't being respected. "Step out of the car," he ordered. Without a word, the man stepped out. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He kept his hands where they could be seen. He stood under the faint glow of the patrol car's headlights, his face tired but patient. The officer walked around the car, checking for anything that could justify his suspicion. There was nothing. No smell of alcohol, no strange items, no signs of danger. Still, he continued to question the man, where he was going, why he was out late, why his ID had a restricted address. The man answered each question calmly. His tone didn't change, but his eyes showed quiet disappointment. He wasn't angry, but it was clear he knew this wasn't just about routine checking anymore. After several minutes, the officer finally handed back the documents. "Next time, be more careful where you drive," he said, though there was no reason for such advice. The man gave a small nod and got back into his car. Before driving away, he said something softly, not as a threat but as a truth. "Sometimes power is more dangerous when it's misjudged, officer." Then he rolled up his window and drove off into the night. The officer stood there watching the car disappear. His chest felt tight. He didn't know why the man's words bothered him so much. Maybe because deep down he knew he had overstepped, but he brushed the thought aside. To him, it was just another driver who needed to learn respect. He got back into his car and continued his shift, unaware that the stop he thought was meaningless would soon become the center of something much bigger. Back at the man's home, things were quiet. He lived alone and didn't seem like someone who liked attention. He made a cup of tea, sat down, and thought about what had happened. He had been stopped many times before for random checks, but this one was different. The officer's tone and attitude stayed in his mind. Not because of anger, but because of what it represented. A misuse of authority, something he had seen in many forms during his career. He didn't rush to take any action that night. He wasn't the kind of person who reacted emotionally. Instead, he waited until morning. When the sun rose, he sent an email to his superior detailing the incident. He didn't exaggerate or demand punishment. He simply described the facts: the stop, the questioning, the dismissive tone, and the unnecessary show of power. The email made its way through channels faster than he expected. Within hours, it reached people who understood the seriousness of what had happened, not because of the inconvenience, but because the officer had unknowingly treated a man with high-level security clearance as a suspect without reason. By evening, a quiet call reached the local police department. The chief picked up, expecting a routine update, but the voice on the other end made him sit upright. It was someone from a federal division, confirming that one of his officers had stopped a defense consultant working under Pentagon authorization. The words hit him like a shock. He looked across the room at his officers, his heart pounding. The caller's tone wasn't angry, but it carried a weight that made it clear this was no ordinary complaint. The chief immediately called for the officer to come in. When he arrived, still wearing his patrol uniform, he looked confused. "Something wrong, sir?" he asked. The chief handed him a piece of paper. "Do you remember stopping this person last night?" The officer glanced at the name and nodded. Yeah, I stopped him for looking suspicious. Why? The chief's expression hardened. Because that man works for the Pentagon. He has clearance higher than anyone in this department. And you decided to treat him like a criminal. The room fell silent. The officer felt a cold weight in his stomach. He tried to explain, saying he was just doing his job, but the chief shook his head. You weren't doing your job. You were feeding your ego. Those words hit harder than anything else. The officer stood speechless, realizing that the calm man he had spoken down to wasn't just anyone. It wasn't about rank or connections. It was about how easily he had let pride cloud his sense of fairness. Later that night, he sat in his car again, parked in the same spot where it all began. The lights of the town looked different now, not peaceful but heavy. He thought about the man's last words. Power is more dangerous when it's misjudged. The sentence echoed in his mind, growing louder each time. He realized he had mistaken power for authority and respect for control. He didn't know what consequences awaited him yet, but deep down, he knew things would never be the same. The man he stopped would go on with his life, but the lesson he left behind would stay with the officer forever. That night, the town remained quiet. No one knew that a single traffic stop had already reached the attention of one of the most powerful officers in the country, and the officer, once proud of his uniform, now sat in silence, staring at his reflection in the patrol car window, wondering when he had lost the line between duty and pride. The night ended with the same stillness it began with, but the air carried something new, a quiet sense that one moment of misjudged power could change everything.